The 1920s and 30s brought hardships for many nations struggling to rebuild from the Great War and deal with the economic and social catastrophes. People were unsure of how the world would progress, and the Great Depression caused an abrupt halt to the Roaring Twenties in America. But one thing was certain: the First World War changed aviation forever, with nations striving for air superiority and trying to develop the best and most advanced aircraft. After the war ended in 1918, the growth of aviation was not stunted, with daredevils pushing the limits of technology and airliners starting to profit off commercial flights. Planes like the four-seater de Havilland DH-16 were used by KLM in the 1920s, jump-starting an early commercial service. People looked to World War I aces and idols as inspiration, and new record-setting flights were being raised higher and higher with a quest for higher speeds and ranges. The first transatlantic flight was flown in 1927 by Charles Lindbergh, and speed records were being set for over 400 miles an hour by 1931. Militaries and newly formed air forces did not take this time of relative peace off, though, as they realized that the old systems of nose-mounted machine guns would have little effect on the new high-speed planes, and it was predicted that if there were to be another war, it would be won through air supremacy. In November of 1935, Britain unveiled its new Hawker Hurricane Mark I, with the new Spitfire coming out just 4 months later. They were both powered by the now famous Rolls-Royce Merlin engines and had 8 Browning machine guns in the wings, doing away with the old dubious gun mounting systems of the previous war. The machine guns on the Spitfire were more spread out, allowing for a less concentrated spray of bullets to give better odds against a high-speed target, rendering the Spitfire more effective. 6 weeks after the hurricane, with disregard to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany released its Messerschmitt Bf 109 with a fuel-injected engine, which became the most numerous plane of World War II, and the chief adversary for the Spitfires and Hurricanes. Despite these new modern designs of planes, many veteran pilots found them overwhelming to fly for the first time, with all the new added speed and firepower, and little information about the specifications and performance. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Second World War officially started, and strategists instantly began thinking of ways to use aviation. The Bf 109 was an integral fighter for the Luftwaffe with a powerful engine, and became highly versatile for bomber escorts, ground attack, recon, and light bombing. It was maneuverable and proved itself previously in the Spanish Civil War, but as the war progressed, the Focke-Wulf 190 became more numerous with a better firing power. The situation in Europe was desperate in the early months for the Allies, with no continental foothold to stage a counterattack, or foreseeable hope of invasion. The strategists believed that bombers alone could win the war, after being proven by the use of bombers in the Spanish Civil War and the Japanese bombing on China. The new metal monoplanes were faster, more capable of intercepting enemy planes, and had longer ranges with more powerful engines. In the early months, the Royal Air Force was no match for the Luftwaffe, as the RAF bombers, which were once considered advanced, became too heavy and slow, and easy targets for Luftwaffe fighters. However, in the Battle of Britain, the Spitfires proved themselves against the Bf 109s in battle, even though the Hurricanes were more numerous. The arms race between Germany and the Allies was evident in the air, as the benefit of new fighter technology swung from one side to another. The Bf 109 was superior to the Hurricane, so the Hurricanes often targeted German bombers and let the Spitfires take the 109 escorts. 1942 brought the 109G variant, which was perhaps the best model, but the 1942 Spitfire Mark IX proved even better. The 109 pilots had to resort to steep dives that their fuel-injected engines could handle in order to escape. The Luftwaffe's air power decreased as the eastern front opened, and they had to operate closer to northern France to cope with their plane's short ranges. The Germans were able to maintain air superiority in the east until the introduction of the MiG-3 in 1943. The Soviet Yak-3 also proved to be a good dogfighter in the east. Tactics used in the air in World War II evolved and changed as technologies advanced. The RAF used their pre-war tactics of flying in tight formations, while the Luftwaffe used battle-proven loose formations. Germany also used planes like the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka for dive bomb attacks, while working closely with panzer formations as aerial artillery. The Stukas also used sound as a weapon, as their sirens, which were spun up by air resistance, changed pitch and volume as airspeed increased. This dive bombing tactic proved devastating for early Allied campaigns. However, in 1941, after the invasion of Britain was cancelled, the RAF went on the offensive. They used a beehive tactic to lure in German fighters into a trap, using lone bombers as bait. The Allies also developed a one-pass rule while raiding German airfields due to heavy anti-aircraft defense. By 1944, the art of close air support was developed. Planes were used to spot targets and help direct ground artillery, and new radio advances made it easy for planes to be used as eyes in the sky. By May of 1942, a few months after they entered the war, America started arriving in Britain with the 8th and 9th Air Forces. While the 9th helped with ground support, the mighty 8th delivered a constant daylight bombardment over Germany. Wartime production skyrocketed in America, with nearly 300,000 aircraft being produced throughout the course of the war. This dramatic increase in production also saved the economy from the economic stagnation of the Great Depression. In 1941, new American planes were brought to the war, like the P-47, which had a strong 2,000 horsepower engine and a ruggedness that made it ideal for ground attack. The first single-seat fighter with twin engines, and the first with the tricycle undercarriage, was the American P-38, which proved itself as a good fighter in the European, Mediterranean, and Pacific theaters. It sacrificed agility for range and speed, which proved effective in the Pacific War against the Japanese A-6M Zeros. Aviation transformed war at sea, with planes being used for anti-ship attacks, and the aircraft carrier becoming the Navy's principal weapon. The War in the Pacific proved this, as Americans relied on big fleet fighters, like the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the F-4U Corsair. The Hellcat turned the tables on the Japanese Zero in September of 1943, with a good gun platform and toughness. The Corsair was the first American fighter to go over 400 miles an hour, and worked with the Hellcat and the P-38 Lightning to overpower the Japanese agility with speed, defense, and range. The Japanese Zero fell behind as the war aged, though it was used until the end. America was out of range from mainland Japan for most of the war until the introduction of the B-29. Along with the Pacific Theater, the Atlantic also saw aviation being used heavily. The Focke-Wulf Condor was the first military aircraft capable of flying across the Atlantic. It was used to bomb American ships along with giving information to U-boats. However, the tide of the Atlantic War was turned as the Allies started using amphibious planes to target German U-boats. The American B-24 also finally had the range for operating in the North Atlantic. Despite bombers not being given priority in Britain due to the shortage of maritime patrol needed to keep U-boats at bay, strategic bombing was used heavily throughout the war. Unlike in the Great War, new, bigger, faster planes with high payloads were able to carry bombs to faraway targets, making bombing more viable and effective. Initially, Germany only felt the need for medium bombers rather than the Allied preference for heavy bombers. Germany considered using heavy bombers, but the prototypes like the HE-177 never saw action. The RAF concentrated on medium bombers in an attempt to match the Luftwaffe numerically, but by 1942 the British Heavy Lancaster was one of the most outstanding bombers of the war. The Lancaster worked with the 8th American Air Force in Britain for their round-the-clock bombing campaign on Germany called Operation Point Blank. The RAF preferred night bombing due to too many casualties to Luftwaffe defense during the day. However, the much more tough and stable American B-17 Flying Fortress flew deep into Germany during the day, being able to take swarms of German fighters. America used daylight bombing for higher accuracy when dropping bombs on the target. As the German opposition grew stronger, British Spitfires and American P-47s escorted the bombers, only limited by their short ranges. In 1943, the new American P-51 Mustang solved this with a longer range, enough to easily make it to Berlin and back. The RAF often experimented with new bombs like the Grand Slam and the bouncing bomb in order to attack German dams and industrial areas. The arms race between nations brought many weird designs and ideas. The race for vertical takeoff and landing planes, or VTOL planes, brought designs like the German Focke-Wulf Triebflügel. America believed it could catch up to European fighters by arming ships with VTOL planes, but the first operational VTOL wasn't until 1967 with the British Harrier jet. Jet fighters were also experimented with in World War II, primarily by the Germans with the HE-178, ME-163, and the most well-known ME-262 and the V-2 rocket program. America also tried to use jets like the Lockheed P-80, but it was too late to see service. Asymmetrical designs like the German BV-141 were also experimented with the gunner off to the side in order to avoid hitting the rudder with gunfire. Twin fuselage designs were also experimented with, like the American P-82 Twin Mustang and the German Bf-109Z. Many of these experimental designs were not prioritized and were too late in the war and in too few numbers to see much action, if any. transport aircraft started to see use during the Second World War as well. Due to growing airline industries in the 30s, planes like the American DC-3 were converted into C-47 military transport planes. However, the development of airborne forces largely started with the Germans and the Soviets in the 1930s. The invasion of Norway in 1940 saw the use of airborne operations from Germany. The largest military transport of the war was the German Me-323. However, Germany didn't use airborne forces much later in the war due to high losses of Ju-52 transports. The Soviets experimented with dropping tanks and crews out of planes, and even put steerable glider wings on a T-60 and called it an A-40. Britain and America started using airborne forces to spearhead their forces in Northwest Africa, and the Allied Airborne Army played a major part in the Normandy landings in the spring of 1944. Transport aircraft were also used in Burma and the South Pacific to drop in supplies. The new designs for planes, including the new streamlined monoplane, came to popularity through the Second World War. They used new lightweight materials like aluminum alloys. These planes also brought closed cockpits, retractable landing gear, landing flaps, radar, and pressurization like in the B-29. These features became integral to modern-day aviation. The Spitfire's developments in aerodynamics and engines also spearheaded the way modern planes are built. Jet engines and new, faster, stronger designs also set the tone for the following decades, as the Cold War began to ramp up. An arms race also began between the radar and recon abilities between America and the Soviet Union, using technologies developed through aviation experiments during World War II.